You've written a little bit about how to optimize DAOs.
Right. So this is part of the same thing that I talked a little bit about earlier. So one of the things that these DAOs always go for is they go for the direct democracy, which is basically not the way to create the most functional possible organization. I mean, imagine like SpaceX is like a direct democracy of like rocket enthusiasts, right? I mean, my God, like, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near the launch pad, right? And so the basically ability to say, oh, I'm sort of going to put aside the like fun of like nerding out over like, votes on the blockchain size or block size or whatever the hell, is basically turns into, no, this is a collective action problem and we want to act collectively as effectively as possible. Therefore, we all want to pull the breadcrumb in the same direction. And so the basic problem of saying, okay, wow, instead of having all the shareholders vote on the new Chipotle flavor, maybe they could vote to elect a CEO. No, that's actually too much democracy. Maybe they could vote to pick a group of people that picks the CEO. And you'll notice that actually there's another, besides corporate governance, of course, there's another well-known system that works exactly this way. It's called the U.S. government. And in fact, you can look at the Electoral College as this sort of crude attempt to basically build sort of something like what I call an accountable monarchy. And, of course, it never worked like that, right? But it was there for a reason. It wasn't there to become an empty formality. And it was there to basically, implement this new form of governance that a lot of these Puritan merchants already had some experience with, and saw that basically running organizations this way really worked very well. And so you can basically say it's like, Ethereum would be a fine example. You have in like a proof of stake system, you have a voting system there already. But if you basically vote for trustees who pick a CEO, the power of that CEO to manage the whole system is just like immense, and it's a totally different world from having like a bunch of committees that like give grants for like quasi art projects or whatever. You can basically be like, no, we're gonna have 75 engineers create the perfect Ethereum mobile app. Like you can actually put centralized energy into it. I was going to mention Mozilla as an example of something a little like this, but some questions about that organization. But but I mean, if you imagine Mozilla sort of trying to get off the ground by like grant funding a browser, like it would never have happened, right? And so
what is the lesson from Mozilla?
The lesson from Mozilla is that basically there are certain things that you can only do with a centralized organization of a certain scale. You could not imagine Intel designing the next family of x86 chips by becoming the Intel Foundation and giving out grants on GitHub for people who like found instruction sets cool.
Right.
Okay. Right. And so it's like it's just a completely different scale of operation, and we have this intrinsic natural human anarchist attraction to these unstructured things. And we love them, and then and they're beautiful, and we just forget how much more effective an army is than a mob.
Right.
And so the thing is that what people are looking for truly in their decentralization is not that it's a decentralized thing with no nervous system and no brain. It's that decentralization creates effective independence. But if you can create that independence in other ways, then you can actually have something much more powerful.
So that's great. So we still have a little bit of time. So tell us a little bit about the specific architectural suggestions that you make in your article about optimized.
So basically, you want something that's sovereign, that's completely defensible. And in order to be completely defensible, the ultimate power, not necessarily the operating power. You can have, okay, maybe if it's the ISIS caliph, that identity should be a secret as well. But no, I mean, the identity of the ISIS, today you can go on Wikipedia and see who the ISIS caliph is, right? How he's chosen, his mystery is, of course, is where he is. But he's still an unidentified person, right? So ideally, of course, you don't want to be in an adversarial relationship toward the powers that be. You just want to be like, okay, you can't mess with me and I don't mess with you.
You want to be imperceptible.
You want to be not necessarily you want to be kind of have a kind of stable neutrality. You want to be, seen as just sort of a feature of the world that doesn't go away.
Right.
And so, but also the idea of like exerting pressure on this thing has to be almost impossible.
You were pretty specific in talking about NFTs, and I'm
right.
Curious, yeah.
So basically, I mean, NFT is just a key that you have, right? So ultimately, what you want is the ultimate sovereignty, not necessarily the operating sovereignty, but the root of sovereignty to reside with a like low double-digit number of anonymous trustees. And you really don't even want these people colluding. You don't want them acting on a regular basis because you don't want them to be part of the management loop. Corporate governance is not corporate governance. It's corporate accountability. Ideally, the board does nothing. And, in some companies like Facebook Meta, the board is vestigial. Zuckerberg has all the voting power. There's no board. And so this is your mechanism for just, you're like, okay, let's say it's the board of Ethereum. Obviously, Vitalik is going to be the Steve Jobs of Ethereum. He's going to be the CEO. Maybe he gets a brain tumor and needs to be replaced. Maybe he discovers girls, and I don't know what could happen, right? He's probably discovered her, but he could go off the rails, right? But he's not likely to go off the rails. And so what you have in these trustees is you have a group of people who this is not their lives. They're just there to basically make sure everything is sane. They don't sort of have a reason to like get together and argue with each other. They just like will meet occasionally to make sure everything's okay. And then if the CEO like dies or something or is, arrested, then obviously you need a new CEO.
Is it essentially the same exact thing as you were proposing for the Bitcoin state, or is it different?
Yes.
Is it different
at
all?
Yes. And so so you have these anonymous trustees, and basically they have a certain ethos under which they operate. Ultimately, it has to come down to such an ethos, but if you have a distributed group of people who don't even know each other, who don't know each other's identities, all they have is this ethos, and they don't have any kind of continuous process that could like bias them in any particular way. So you are getting kind of a wisdom of crowds there if your crowd is very well selected. So the way you basically, and if you hold one of these keys, one of these NFTs, whatever it is, the ethos is basically nobody knows your identity. If your identity is disclosed, you need to pass the key on to someone whose identity only you know. You need to basically, like, your lawyer has an envelope in the event of my death, here's who gets the key, right? And so you really have this world where nobody knows and could imagine knowing what this identity is as soon as it's gone through sort of one phase of anonymization there. This group of people, they don't know each other's identity. No one knows who they are. They might as well be a force of nature.
Yeah, you talk about the first board is elected in a kind of public reputation game, just like any electoral politics.
Sure, or any delegated proof of stake or anything like that.
But once that first elected board is elected, they then in private and in secrecy choose nominate the next board, which is the functioning board.
Yes. And so you get this group of people that is just like they're all bearing. You assume that most of them are basically good. They don't really have an opportunity to collude. They don't have a motivation to collude. They would be like, if one of them comes to like collude, someone's like, maybe we should form a little cabal. You'd be like, wow, that's weird. I'll tell everyone else about that, right? And so the sort of the centripetal forces that would cause that to centralize and cause it to basically not operate as a backup mechanism, but to operate basically as a junta governing itself, aren't even really present. Mm-hmm. Nobody really has an incentive to even try starting to do that. So the system stays basically it stays not decentralized, but just simply redundant. And that redundancy where basically, yeah, well, one of these keys get lost, well, one of them, whatever it may be. But the redundancy is sort of enough to basically create a system that's really effectively invulnerable. And it's just like, it's really easy to drop a transaction on the internet without anyone knowing where the hell it came from,
because it's such a vast sea.
It's such a vast, it's a few bits in a vast sea, right? And so then basically, as long as they can replace the CEO really can't be coerced, because basically he would have to be like coerced in secret, but then whatever he was doing would be in the real world.
Basically,
as soon
as the CEO is compromised or becomes inadequate or
the CEO is just replaced,
then they
you can arrest the caliph. You just get a new caliph, right?
It would be like the board could just invalidate the key. Belongs to the CEO, right?
That's right. And so basically, when you look at then you start to see, okay, to what extent can I operate an organization entirely in crypto space? Then you sort of segue into, okay, can we imagine this as a real world governance structure? And one of the fun things about imagining it as a real world governance structure is there's a sort of real world, it's sort of the reverse of an oracle, I guess you could say, which is called a permissive action link, which is used currently only on nuclear weapons. And basically, the nuclear weapons will not fire unless you have the right key. And so, there's no, I know how much gun people love smart guns, and I know how much they love like networked guns, but this is a military, folks, right? This is like, and so, you can easily imagine a military which cryptographically is forced to obey the chain of command. Either that or use its guns as clubs, right? And so you actually have, weapons at all levels. You have a whole military armed with weapons that won't work unless the cryptographic chain of command is correct.
And that would be governed by this secret pseudonymous board.
Right, ultimately. Right. And so basically, there you have sort of, the end-to-end chain of like, okay, this is an accountable monarchy in the real world that would be very hard to displace with any particular force.
And it's not even totally anti-democratic in the sense that you do reserve the function of the populace to at least recall the board whenever.
Well, yeah, that's one thing. I mean, if you want to put that safety, of course, one man's safety net is another man's catastrophic risk, right? But you can of course put safety nets like that in if you're concerned with, okay, what if this somehow becomes dystopian in a way that we can't imagine? But I mean, there's nothing dystopian about this design. It's just just sounds dystopian.
Okay, fascinating.